Welcome to Strength for Today's Pastor, conversations with current senior pastors and leaders which will strengthen and help you in your pastoral ministry. And now, here's your host, Bill Holdridge of Poimen Ministries.
Welcome to Strength for Today's Pastor. This is episode number 146, and today we're going to deal with a subject that should be and is on the heart of many pastors or leaders in churches anywhere. It's pretty important. It's paradigm shifting. It's vision altering, this approach to ministry. And what we're talking about is the equipping of the saints for ministry, and in particular, prepping the younger folks for leadership in the church. We're speaking with Patrick Farrell, who is the senior lead pastor of Calvary Chapel, Wichita, Kansas. Patrick led a major shift in the church he has pastored for 13 years. It began around 8 years ago. It all happened as a result of a conversation Patrick had with another pastor, interestingly enough, about eschatology, which is one of Patrick's favorite teaching emphases. So Patrick, you and I, we first connected when Poimen Ministries Pastor Al James helped transition the church to your leadership all those years ago. You had been serving with Lloyd Pulley at Old Bridge Calvary Chapel in New Jersey, and you were the guy that the Lord had pointed to take over in Wichita. And then eventually I came through Wichita on a trip on the way to Fort Smith, Arkansas. And ironically, the night I taught there, and thanks for having me again, my 93-year-old mother went to heaven that very night.
Your mom went home to the Lord.
Yeah, she did. I'll never forget that night. It has warm memories for me on so many fronts, but, she was absent from her body that day and present with the Lord. So anyway, all of that's to say, welcome to the program. Really, thanks for joining us. Looking forward to this.
It's great to be here, and I'll always be grateful to Pastor Al and his ministry, transitioning Calvary Wichita, and of course, praying and recruiting me and helping me settle in and make a lot of the hard decisions and do all the things that transitional pastors do to ensure the continued operation of a fellowship.
Yeah, that was a wonderful one to watch. I mean, it wasn't the easiest circumstance that you stepped into. I understand that. Well, let's talk about the paradigm shift in your thinking. Before we do, though, you had written recently 3 articles, which you entitled Article A, Article B, and Article C, as a result of a request from Pastor Tim Brown from Calvary Chapel, Fremont in California, and he was there visiting, speaking, and watching what was going on and seeing it, and he thought, have you ever written this down? But you talk about the paradigm shift in your thinking in those articles. So tell us what happened. How did it change your perspective on ministry and what you're doing now?
Yeah, Tim was out here doing our men's retreat, and as we were having breakfast before he was going to fly back, he said, what you're doing is interesting, and have you ever written it down? And I said, well, no, because the Lord just kind of birthed it organically, and we've been too busy doing the ministry to really codify or systematize it. He said, well, I'd be interested in reading some thoughts. And so I started putting some thoughts down. What began was, what it ended up being was one article about the why, one article about the what, one article about the how. And the why, the paradigm shift that you called it, it really was rooted in 2 things. One was philosophy and one was opportunity. And the philosophical shift happened years ago, actually, in a conversation with another pastor. And I don't know what we were talking about, but he sort of out of the blue asked me, has it ever occurred to you that every generation since Christ has labored and ministered and served and worshiped, believing that they might well be the last generation? And I said some smart aleck kind of duh, that's why they call it the doctrine of imminence. And he said, but everyone was convinced, the Thessalonians thought that they'd missed it. And every generation has been for various reasons convinced that they were laboring in the shadow of Christ's soon return. And I said, what are you getting at? And he said, what if we're not? What if we're not the last generation? And I came to Christ through a ministry that was heavily rooted in prophecy. And so my early Christian walk, my formative years as a believer were really, the signs of the times and the coming world leader and one world currency and mark of the beast technology and look at Iran and Turkey and Russia aligning. And I said, well, how could we not be? And he said, but isn't that the conversation that 2,000 years of believers have had? How could we not be? And that really, that is provocative in a lot of different ways. But what it set off in my mind was, if that's true, then we need to think hard about how we're doing ministry. What it kind of shook loose in my brain is, yes, we need to witness and worship under the assumption that we very well might be the last generation. Today might be the last day. But we also have to be prepared for the possibility that we will be yet another generation that passes the baton to the next that awaits Christ's soon return. I share this with a pastor friend who had dabbled in professional baseball, and he said, well, that's what you do when you stand in the batter's box. You look fastball, but you have to be ready to adjust to the curve. Mm-hmm. And so that was a philosophical shift for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it led you into a series of decisions that we'll talk about. But it's interesting that it came to you through prophecy, and we'll ask that question again too. So you wrote that before this shift in thinking, your writing says that you felt yourself doing ministry wrong. So what did you mean by that? What do you think you had been doing wrong?
I don't know if I was doing it wrong so much as I was prioritizing wrong, because I'd been making disciples from my earliest days as a believer. I read what Jesus said, as you're going, make disciples. And so I was, and I'd always been burdened, especially for the 20-something generation. I grew up Catholic. I walked away from my Catholicism when I was 16 or 17, and I lost a decade to the enemy. And so the Lord told me early on as a believer that investing in that generation would be how he would restore the years that the locusts had eaten in my life. So it was always a very personal burden for me to be the person that I needed when I was younger, so to speak. But it was personal ministry. And even after I went on staff at Calvary Old Bridge, I had tremendous freedom even as an intern and then as a pastor. Lloyd basically said, do what's important. Pray and seek the Lord and do the things that the Lord shows you. But I didn't feel that I had the freedom, and this was completely self-imposed. This was my own trip. Discipleship seemed like personal ministry rather than 9-to-5 ministry, rather than at the church ministry. And I think it's because in the back of my mind, because of the way that I came to Christ, equipping the next generation, well, why? We are the last generation. So yeah, we're going to train the people in front of us to do the ministry that's right in front of us. But the ministry that's coming and those that will follow, I didn't assign it the right priority in my heart.
That makes sense. And, we try to make an emphasis with Pointman Ministries that if Jesus doesn't come back relatively soon, someone else will eventually be pastoring your church. So why not pastor your church now with the thought that someone else is going to be pastoring your church? What do you want the church to look like? How are you going to pass this on? And those kinds of things. But that combines with the frustration and I think the fear that a lot of pastors have. They look around and they see a lot of gray hair and they don't see a lot of young people in their churches. And this is relatively common. And this isn't to say anything negative or disparaging at all. It's just the reality. We get older and we tend to reach a certain group of people in our churches, and our churches are getting older as a rule or as a tendency. And pastors don't know what to do. They are concerned about it, and I hear it in prayer meetings. a lot, pray for the young people, Lord, bring them to us and whatever. But there are things that can help that happen, which is why I think this is important that we talk about. So what we just said about someone else possibly pastoring our churches, that's kind of what you're talking about. But I'm interested in your thoughts on that, Patrick. What are your thoughts?
It's interesting. Years and years ago, I was asked to join a church board of a small Calvary that had gone through some churn, some turmoil, and there were three of us that were invited onto the board to bring some stability and right the ship, so to speak, the kind of thing you do on a regular basis. And as we were onboarding, so to speak, and getting to know that church and that culture, one of the questions that was asked at a board meeting was what's in place as far as succession planning. And the pastor laughed, and the brother who was asking the question said, "No, seriously." And I remember the board meeting clearly because the senior pastor there, and he'd been the senior pastor for many years, genuinely didn't understand the question. And so it was put to him again, if you go home to the Lord, if you get hit by a bus, if any of the ways that God can take us home, what happens next? And he laughed again, and he said, well, that will be your guys' problem. And we looked around the table, and we were sort of horrified. And another brother said, do you study before you teach a Sunday morning message? Well, of course I do. And he was somebody that was well known for teaching from notes, as I do. And he said, well, of course I do. And he said, do you ask your worship team to rehearse before Sunday morning praise? And he said, oh, I just asked a worship leader to step down because he didn't rehearse enough. Okay, well, isn't it the same principle? Yes, you expect God has promised to meet you in the pulpit. He's promised to anoint your praise team as they lead, but that's not to the exclusion of preparation. You also believe that God will honor you, meet you and honor your time of preparation. How is this any different? And I thought that was a compelling analogy, and I thought that would settle it. The pastor still didn't get it. And what I came to realize was that it hadn't been modeled for him. None of his mentors had ever invested time in succession planning, had talked about succession planning. When they sent him out, it wasn't one of the points of emphasis that they had equipped him with. And in a tribe like ours, where we emphasize so much of ministry being caught, not taught, and rightly so, the fact that he hadn't been in a context to catch it, he really couldn't find it within himself to assign priority to it, and I think that's tragic.
Well said. I love those comments, and the idea of preparation, so key in all of this. And boy, yeah, I like those analogies. Those are great. So, you've got now, and this has morphed into this, a number of young people involved at Calvary Chapel, Wichita, and you have a number of interns, and they're active, and you're giving them responsibility and authority as they are raised up. And by the way, I'm thankful for you, Patrick, in so many ways, but you are one of those guys that are part of our tribe that are providing a model for others. And that's why we're doing this podcast. As you know, this is a model of the how, not so much the emphasis on the how, but the why and the things that lead up to it, the heart of an internship program. So you got a lot of interns, and they're around and whatever. But you said in another thing that you wrote that a pastor friend refers to Calvary Wichita as a ministry training program disguised as a church. That sounds like a real compliment to me. But you found that description somewhat redundant. You asked yourself, aren't all fellowships supposed to be equipping the saints for the work of the ministry? Ephesians 4:12. So talk about that. You said for many years your church wasn't an equipping church. So tell the story of what happened from the time before the changes began to what's going on right now.
Well, let me back up. It's certainly not to my credit that we're doing what we're doing. The Lord has really orchestrated it from early experiences He afforded me as a pastor, and the ways that He's burdened me, and the unique set of circumstances that I walked into here. You used the phrase paradigm shift earlier, and I said the first part was philosophy, the second part was opportunity, and I didn't know the opportunity that the Lord had given me at Wichita until really He forced the issue. Some of the context, but for the benefit of the listeners, I'm the church's third pastor. It's a church that's had two very difficult pastoral transitions, planted in 1981, and since then I think 5 church splits. Some amicable, some very not so. And when I came here, it was a church that had endured trauma. And Pastor Al did a wonderful job of stopping the bleeding. He stabilized the patient, if you will. He made the unpopular decisions that were necessary, and that's just one of the great things that transitional pastors do, because you're in a fellowship for a short time. You can make the difficult decisions. You can say, look, this is going to hurt, but the surgery is going to help save the patient in the long term. And he did that so wonderfully, and he set me up for success. But as we were transitioning, one of the things he imparted to me, and one of the things that the Lord shared with me, was to let the fellowship rest, to allow people a season of just abiding after a difficult time. And they were ready for that. But what I failed to recognize is that the people who remained with the church through a season of trauma and loss and confusion were faithful. That was their defining quality. The couple dozen, 3 dozen or so folks who were here were the faithful ones. They poured their heart, their blood and tears literally into the fellowship. And what I was slow to apprehend is that a strength overplayed as a weakness. They were faithful to a fault, quite literally. The other thing that I was slower than I should have been to recognize is that many of them had been trained up in a culture of humility. Humility in the sense of don't volunteer, don't raise your hand, don't offer to help, wait to be asked. Another strength overplayed, becoming a weakness. I was raised up under Pastor Lloyd in a culture of, here I am, Lord, use me. I gained a mentor early on in my ministry because I listened to my pastor teach a message, and the application of the message is, if you want to be mentored, go find a mentor. The responsibility of discipleship rests with the one who wants to be discipled. And so there was a little bit of a difference in assumption or expectation. And when I became aware of that was after a few years here at the church. I had a couple wonderful seasoned leaders come to me very apologetically, almost in tears, and for different reasons, expressing that they needed to step down and we're sorry, and we don't want to leave you hanging, and this just grieves us, but we need to. And in one case it was health, and in one case it was family, but really good, godly reasons. And but in talking with them and doing, I guess you'd call it an exit interview or a transition conversation, what I gleaned for both of them is that they would have stepped down sooner given the opportunity. They had felt led to transition out of their roles for some time, but I hadn't asked the question, and by training and by temperament, they were not going to raise their hand. And I took that to the Lord in prayer. The Holy Spirit began tapping on my shoulder and saying to me, "This means more than you think it means. This means more than it is." And as I prayed and sought the Lord, basically said, "How many more people like that are there in your ministry team?" So we called a meeting, and years later, if you ask folks who were there about the meeting, everyone will know what we're talking about. And we basically said, I conferred with my elders, and we agreed on this course of action, and together we went into this meeting, and we said, okay, as of now, no one has a job, including me. No one has a title, no one has a role. We'll assign people to responsibilities for Sunday so that the trains run on time. But for the next 30 days, there are no pastors, there are no elders, there are no deacons, there are no overseers. Let's take a month and fast and pray and seek the Lord. What does he have for us today? Let's not assume that today has anything to do with yesterday. Let's ask the Lord for fresh vision. And the Lord answered just marvelously. We had board members who came to me and said, I feel so liberated. I'm not supposed to be on this board anymore. I was here for a season, but the Lord is calling me to do something else. We had an elder who said, I'm serving out of guilt and obligation. I'm serving out of a sense of misplaced loyalty. My ministry is somewhere else. We had people who had been faithfully shepherding ministries who said, my ministry isn't here anymore. It was, but now it's there. And we had people who said, my ministry is with my family right now. Or is it okay for me to go serve in a parachurch ministry outside the four walls of Calvary Wichita? And so after that sort of series of transitions, we were left with some gaps. And that's when the opportunity, the second part of the transition came. And I wasn't looking for it and I wasn't planning for it, but the Lord just brought it. We had gaps. After all of the senior saints, the tenured workers had sought and prayed and said, hey, this is where I feel called, and counseled with other believers, and the Lord bore witness. We had opportunities. And at the same time, we had this group of young people who were eager to serve. They were standing on the sidelines saying, put me in, coach. And that birthed the second part of the shift, where we said, for our church to continue and prosper and serve the way that God is calling us to, these people, these young people, are going to need to play an active, vital, substantive role. And so we began to put them into leadership positions.
Well, that tells me a couple things, Patrick. One is that you had a heart for the saints to find their role, their niche, their things that the Holy Spirit was pointing them to, and it didn't depend upon whether or not they were loyal to the church program so much. You wanted them to be equipped for the ministries the Lord had called them. That's a hard place to get into when you've got a machine moving in a church and you've got all these needs and all these things, but you did a radical thing. You and your elders agreed together to say, okay, 30 days, nobody has a position or a title. Oh my, that was radical, but it ended up producing an open door for the next thing.
It's funny because we had someone who was, I can't remember, but somebody from Calvary Old Bridge, from my home church, was here while that was happening. And the next day I got a call from Lloyd saying, I heard you fired all of your staff. Are you crazy? And but when I explained to him more fully the context, he said, well, that sounds fantastic. But it's really what Pastor Chuck taught all of us. And of course, you spent so much more time with Chuck than I did. But every room that I was ever in with Pastor Chuck, he said some version of seek the Lord, wait on the Lord, and when you hear from the Lord, hasten to obey the Lord. And so it really was not any, grand or glorious scheme or ambition or plan or program on our part. It was just a recognition, hey, what we've been doing is not working. And we can flail about, or we can just fast and pray and say, Lord, what do you have? And what he gave us, you mentioned the metaphor I was using earlier. The metaphor that he gave us for what we've been doing for the last 7 or 8 years is we're a teaching hospital. Mm-hmm. Every church is a hospital for sinners. We say that, right? Mm-hmm. And we say it for good reason. It's true. But the vision that the Lord gave us is that we're a teaching hospital. What does that mean? Well, if you go to a private hospital and pay lots and lots of money, you're going to expect lots of gray-haired doctors with advanced degrees and lots of training who have been in their area of specialty for decades, and that's what you get. If you go to a hospital that's run by a medical school, you've got medical students and interns supervised by residents who are providing the frontline care, and they're supervised by, an attending physician or two. But the frontline ministry or the frontline medicine, I should say in that case, is done by students and interns. And that's the metaphor that the Lord gave us to kind of anchor what we're doing, what he's called us to do, the mental model, if you will.
So the key there is allowing it to happen, granting opportunity for the folks sitting on the sidelines saying, here I am, coach, put me in, but providing mentorship and oversight and gentle guidance as needed so that they can learn and grow. So there were hiccups along the way that you had mentioned, and some things that happened with the result of this new influx of leaders and the older leaders now out of a job, so to speak, perhaps in some cases. What were those hiccups? What happened?
I mean, any change, there are going to be hiccups. The one that we were ready for was pride, and we were very conscious. Paul warns against raising one up too quickly. And even though we were prepared for it, it still happened. We in some cases elevated people to too much responsibility too soon, or we elevated them to X level of responsibility, and they reached out and grabbed for themselves X times 2 or X times 3. And so there was that calibration, and there always is. Besides the real incidents of pride, there was also the specter of pride. There were folks of your generation and my generation looking at these teens and 20-somethings saying, well, they think they're leaders, that must be pride. And of course, it rarely was. What it was young people serving in places that people weren't necessarily used to seeing young people. I remember a conversation with one of our worship leaders at the time, and he said, what do they think they're doing? And I said, they're leading worship. He said, well, they should be leading worship in children's church. Or maybe you could set them up to lead worship in a home group. And they can lead worship for the youth ministry. And I said, right, but if we don't start training them to lead adults in worship now, who will lead the adults in worship when you step down? Oh, I don't know, but we're still here. So, basically figure that out after we leave. And I said, or you could start incorporating some of these young vocalists, some of these young musicians in what you're doing. And there was basically an impasse. No, we want to keep doing what we've been doing. We've been doing it for 20 years. It's not broken. Why fix it? And I remember something that Pastor Al said during our transition. He said, Patrick, never forget, it's each generation's privilege to let the next generation teach us their music. And I think about that often. Of course, that's just one ministry and one example, but there were some people. Well, young people are serving in positions of responsibility where we're not used to seeing them. That must be pride. Well, no, not necessarily. Not if they're being supervised. Not if they're there at the behest of the elders. Other hiccups, just communication, and I thought I was over communicating. But the old adage, the best place to keep a secret is put it in the church bulletin. Or the other best place to keep a secret is to tell everyone in announcements. We can broadcast and communicate and over communicate something, but I underestimated people's ability to use the same word and attach different meanings to it. What do you mean by leader? What do you mean by overseer? What do you and so there were some things that needed to be sorted out as far as what did this vision practically mean? And of course, churches, like any organizations, have inertia, and in some cases people would hear the words, but deep down they would be convinced, okay, this is flavor of the month, but at the end of it, we're just going to keep doing what we've been doing as long as we've been doing what we're doing, because that's how we do what we do. And so those kinds of things, the predictable things mostly. Mm-hmm. And mostly the way you asked, how did we get through it? Lots and lots of conversations, and one-on-one conversations. You can only share vision from the pulpit so much and so many times. At the end of the day, all ministry is retail, right? Mm. And in shifting our philosophy of ministry, that really needed to be a lot of retail, incarnational, hey, let's go get coffee, let's talk about your concerns, let's talk about what this means to you, and let's hash it out.
So you did a couple of things here that I just want to comment on and just say I just love it. One is when pride occurred, real pride occurred, you called it what it was, and you dealt with it relationally with the person that was in that. That's epic. And then the next thing is where assumed pride was being talked about, you quantified it and you defined it so that real pride could be defined, so everybody understood that these young people aren't necessarily proud. They might have godly ambition. Actually, have you thought of that? Yeah. It might be something that's a good thing. So they've stepped up. So I just think that's awesome, and the way it's worked out. So how has it been working out? You've got a team of interns now that are doing, as you said, the bulk of the ministry. The day-to-day leadership of the fellowship is actually largely in the hands of the interns.
A lot of it is. There are some ministries that are not necessarily by design, but just by the way things have played out. Our men's ministry is led by a few older brothers, and the men's ministry at our church is largely older brothers. We've got a seniors ministry that's obviously led by seniors. My wife leads the women's ministry. A lot of the counseling is done by older folks in the church. Our facilities ministry, that's really a split, and that's a neat place where we see the older teaching the younger, and passing on knowledge and know-how. But children's church, nursery, youth ministry, outreach, worship, pastoral care in the sense of visitation, those things are largely in the hands of 20-something interns, in some cases teenage interns. We just had our vacation Bible school last week. First time we've done it in several years. COVID and a variety of other reasons. And as I sat back and watched, it was really everything that we've been trying to get to, because all of the leadership across the board were teens and 20-somethings. But in almost every case, we had 25% of our church, 35% of our church serving at Vacation Bible School. And it was younger folks who were doing the coordinating, who were doing the teaching, leading the worship, organizing, and so forth. But almost every one of them had one or two older brothers or sisters in the Lord alongside, being great servants because they'd been leaders. They knew what does a teacher need? I'm going to be your assistant, and I'm going to anticipate your needs. Hey, what does a worship leader need? I'm going to set the stage, and I'm going to run sound for you, and I'm going to serve you in that capacity. So as I sat back, it was really the kind of a coalescence of a lot of what we've been envisioning and praying and working toward.
That reminds me of a conversation with a pastor years ago who was getting older as I was, and he referred to the situation with the Levites. They could serve, but when they were 50, they were to be taken out of the duty so that they could actually train the next generation. And he saw himself as being that. That's what his older years were going to be. And that's an honorable role. I mean, my goodness, what a great role to have that kind of influence.
It's a difficult transition. People who write about leadership talk about the most difficult transition we make in our careers being when we go from doing things, being an individual contributor, to getting things done through people and supervising others. And it's very much that same kind of transition, setting aside the pleasure, the gratification of ministry well done for the gratification of watching someone else pick up the ball and run with it. It's it's not always pretty. It's not always smooth. One of the things that we've come to realize, it's not unlike a sports team. And any given season, sports teams are gearing up for the championship, or they're hoping to make the playoffs, or, oh gosh, this is a rebuilding year. And, we went through a season a couple years ago. We sent a couple to a Calvary in Northern California to assist the work there. We sent another couple to a Calvary in Utah to assist the work there. One young woman who had been with us went back home to Florida. We had a couple go out and get involved in church planting on the other side of Wichita in an inner city neighborhood. And so we entered a rebuilding year, and we were slower than we should have been to appreciate, a lot of our quote unquote veterans, young but people who had been doing a substantial amount of ministry, had gone out in answer to the Lord's call. And when you put on the wall of your church that our mission is to win, build, and send disciples for Jesus. From time to time, you're going to send disciples. We send a bunch all at once. And one of the things that we've learned is that this isn't a linear process where people are with us for X number of months or X number of years, and then they graduate in some sort of rhythmic, predictable fashion. It's more chaotic than that. And so even right now, we're in a little bit of a rebuilding season. What does that mean? It means that we have to calibrate the type of ministry that we're doing and the scope of the ministry that we're doing to the personnel that our general manager, the Lord, has drafted for our team.
Love the sports analogies. It's great. So it has been, what you're doing, it has been called an intern program, and you did say that you think that's a bit of an overstatement. But let's get into the what or the how, I guess, a little bit. What's your approach with the interns? And you wrote in your Article C the different layers in your approach. Maybe you could explain some of that for us, because that will help people, wrap their mind around what's likely to occur.
Sure. I mean, for context, we're a church of around 200 people, including kids. Tim Brown's line is we're 200 counting kids because kids count, and I like that. I came from a church of several thousand, and we had a school of ministry, and with classes and experiences and rotations and different kinds of ministry. And I made a couple attempts to recreate a version of that here, and they failed spectacularly. And what my wife actually counseled me as I was lamenting the second or third failed attempt to launch a school of ministry. She said, "Patrick, embrace the small. We're a small church. We can be flexible. We can be accommodating, and we can be adaptive in a way that sometimes a large church can't. So why not pivot to our strength?" And that was a word from the Lord. Mm-hmm. So we have interns who are with us for a summer. We have a summer intern right now. We have some people that we call interns who have been interns for 3, 4, 5 years. We have some who are full-time at the church. We have some that are out in the world, serving in their different vocations, and that's their mission field. But they're also substantially involved and very intentionally leaning in and being equipped and growing in their gifting and in their ministry as well. One of the, Tim had said, "Hey, jot down some thoughts that you have," and I kind of did it as a top 10 list for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. And he said, "How do you recruit?" I said, "Well, we don't really." One of my youth pastors along the way had a vision for discipling young people and equipping young people and getting them substantially involved. And so when the Lord opened the door for us to pivot hard to intern-led ministry, we had people who had grown up serving in the church as middle schoolers, as high schoolers, and they were the ones saying, "Hey, put us in, coach." And that really has propagated, I think is the right word. We don't recruit for the most part. Occasionally, a pastor friend will call up and say, "Hey, can I send you somebody?" Hey, that's great. But a lot of times it's young people from our church who go to Bible college and meet people and they share the vision of what's happening here. So starting with youth has been key for us. Explaining the vision. One of the first things that I try to impart to people who are visiting, who are praying about whether we're their church, they've moved to the area, or people who get saved and they're getting plugged in, is, hey, you have to understand what we're doing here, because it might be different than their previous church context or their assumptions about church. Count the cost is something that we remind people of regularly. As a fellowship, we're paying to mentor these interns, and in some cases it's through tithes and offerings. We're giving them a stipend, but everyone is paying in the sense that if a young intern is filling in for me, that might not be the most polished message people have ever heard. If we're putting a new musician on the stage, they might hit some wrong chords. Collectively, we're paying the price and the return on investment is the next generation is going to be equipped and seasoned and strengthened for ministry. But we remind people of that regularly so that we're excited about it, so that we don't feel burdened by it, but blessed by the fact that we get to do this. And that goes into rejoicing in imperfection. We have a close relationship with a parachurch ministry in the area that's a residential facility for boys and young men who are sort of between the foster care system and the judicial system. And it's boys and young men who have been through hard things. And the folks from our fellowship and the folks that serve there remind us, hey, it's not the velocity, it's the trajectory. The change might not be rapid. In some cases, it might not be be dramatic, but look for small improvements and celebrate the incremental progress. And we try to reinforce that here as well. Hey, you can nitpick the brother who filled in for me on a Wednesday night, but think about when he filled in 6 months ago, and think about how much more comfortable he was and how much more unction he had, and let's celebrate the progress together. Talking to my older brothers and sisters in the fellowship, we remind each other it is hard to give ministry away, and it's a challenge, because for a lot of us, we're tempted to find our identity in ministry. I am what I teach. I am who I counsel. I am who I mentor. But if my identity is truly in Christ, then my ministry is just a stewardship. But that's the sort of thing that bears reminding and reinforcing. Embrace differences. That goes into embracing the small, recognizing that not every intern is cut from the same cloth. We don't have the same expectations for all of them, and that's okay. Some people get hung up on consistency. Another sports metaphor, Phil Jackson was the most successful basketball coach in the 90s, and when asked what the secret to his success was, he said, you can't coach Michael Jordan the same way that you coach Scottie Pippen, the same way that you coach Steve Kerr, the same way that you coach, these other players. To treat everybody equally, you have to treat them differently. And so we really try to remind people how important that is. Pursue breadth and depth. It's tempting when you see somebody's conspicuous gifting to put them in the corresponding ministry. It's also tempting in a tribe like ours that does emphasize humility. Hey, let's put you someplace that you're going to hate, so that you learn what it is to serve the Lord and submit to leadership. We try to do both, and we try to do neither. We try to give people an opportunity to serve in their gifting, because God has gifted them, and God didn't gift them to withhold opportunities for them to use their gifting. By the same token, most people that are training up here, we expect will serve in small churches. And so we want them to have a well-rounded perspective of what goes on in a church and where can you contribute that might be outside of your most conspicuous gifting. One of the best things that Lloyd ever did for me is, as a young pastoral intern, he put me over missions. I didn't know the first thing from missions. I said to him, we've got like 40 ministries at the church. I know more about 39 of them than I know about missions. I know more about women's ministry than I know about missions. And he said, good, because I want you to learn to serve from a place of dependency. And so I'd been a teacher my whole adult life. I didn't get to teach, I think, for my first year on staff. But by the time that the Lord opened the door to teach small groups or from the pulpit or whatever, I had learned the difference between teaching in skill and technique and teaching in the Spirit, which was really important. So we try to balance that. We try to be intentional about community. If we're not careful, we can ghettoize our congregation, and seniors spend time with seniors, and young people spend time with young people. And inadvertently, I drove us there for a while. As we put so much emphasis on equipping young people, I wasn't spending enough time with the rest of the body. And everybody needs leadership, and everybody wants to spend time with their pastor and with their elders. And I was also in emphasizing my own ministry to the younger folks. I was not capitalizing on the opportunity that a whole generation of people in the church had with their gifting and their knowledge and their experience to impart to these folks. So we've been a lot more intentional about cross-generational ministry and partnering and equipping. Building in the basics, this is what we all know is that ministry can become idolatry. And if we don't really consistently bring people back to their devotional life, their private worship, their prayer time, it's easy for ministry to eclipse those things. Mm-hmm. And we're giving young people an opportunity to get excited about serving, and that's great. But my excitement for serving the Lord should never eclipse my excitement for the Lord and my relationship with Him. So we come back to that again and again. To my brother pastors and to the other elders of the church, we've learned the hard way that if you get into ministry like this, you have to be ready for heartbreak. We can't tell wheat from tares until they're fully grown, and I tell everyone going into youth ministry, just be ready, because youth ministry will break your heart, and this isn't that different. People that you pour into and invest in will make unfortunate decisions, and that's just what it is. That's not a reason to not equip and invest in young people, but it's a reason to go in eyes open. And I think the other point I made was debrief absolutely everything. As we've been very, I keep using the word intentional, but as we've been very intentional, planful around creating opportunities for ministry to be caught as well as taught, for people to learn by doing. There's an old Chinese proverb: what I hear, I forget; what I see, I remember; what I do, I understand. And we're letting people learn by doing, but they don't always learn from what they don't always see the lessons that to you and I would be intuitive. You run an event, or you have a Sunday morning service, or you watch a ministry. And with our mature eyes, our seasoned eyes, well, okay, the lesson learned is obvious. Everybody sees it. Good? Great. See you next week. No, we have to slow down and have the conversation. What did everybody see? What lessons is the Lord showing you? And hey, guess what? Many times they're teaching me because they're attenuated to different stuff than I am. And so we, after every Sunday service, after every event, after every week of ministry, we get together and we talk about, hey, what is the Lord showing us? What are we learning? How are we growing? We go into this expecting mistakes. That's part of how, as a fellowship, we're investing in this generation. We're going to let them mess up. And hopefully, with the attending physicians, with the pastors and elders, we're a safety net to keep anything catastrophic from happening. But if we don't want them to make the same mistakes again, then they have to learn, and that means we have to stop and make sure we're harvesting the learning. Well,
wow, what a great flyover on all those points. So start with the youth, explain the vision, count the cost, rejoice in imperfection, recognize the challenge, embrace differences, pursue both breadth and depth, be intentional about community, build in the basics, prepare for heartbreak, debrief everything. And those last 2 points, Patrick, I think were worth the price of admission, but it was all good. What a great thing. I mean, just think of the heartbreak. I can't even imagine the heartbreak of our Lord Jesus. At losing Judas, that was a heartbreaking thing for him. He loved Judas, and watching the disciples fall or fail or flay around, but he was always ready to restore them, to coach them, to encourage them, but prepare for heartbreak. And then we tend, as you've pointed out in a couple of points during this podcast interview, communication is necessary, but debriefing is such an essential part of communication. I think we're all not naturally good at that. So I thank you for that encouragement. That's excellent.
In ministry, you have a tendency to be on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Sunday happened, and Sunday's coming. And if we don't, it's the old adage: if you don't take the time to do it right, you're going to have to make the time to do it again. If we don't harvest the learning from a mistake, the same mistake is going to happen again.
Yeah.
And at some point, the people in our fellowship who are investing in this endeavor will lose grace. So part of it is just our commitment to loving the people in the body. Hey, as you're saying, hey, let's tolerate a little bit of flailing around and some experimentation and some things that just will fall on their face. Our commitment is hey, we're going to try not to fall the same way twice. We're going to go out and make new mistakes next week.
Okay, fair enough. Excellence, but not perfection. That's the way Al James put it one time.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a great line. Okay, so Patrick, here's your time for the 2-minute drill. We've been using all these sports analogies, so now we're coming to the 2-minute drill. You got a couple minutes to share your heart directly with senior pastors. They're in the room with you. You're speaking to them about this or any related subject on your heart. Go.
I think the most important thing that I could share is it is impossible to impart to anyone all of the do's and don'ts, all of the whys and the wherefores, and the how-to and the how-not-tos of ministry. I don't know if it's a generational thing, but I encounter a lot of young people who want the playbook. There's your sports analogy. They want the process map. They want they want the list of, if I do all of these things, I'll be successful. If I avoid all of these things, ministry's not like that. God leads us moment by moment, and trying to cultivate in anyone, young or old, a dependency, a yieldedness, a surrender to the Spirit, that we can be led by the eye and not by the bridle. And one of the tools that I try to impart to our folks to assist in that is to always be asking the question, what does love do? What would love say in this situation? It's a slightly different version of back in the 90s, the WWJD, what would Jesus do? I was part of an organization years ago that was values driven, and they had this idea: we can't train our people to deal with every contingency, but we can train them when they deal with something that's unknown or unforeseen, something that's new or unexpected. Ask yourself, what would be consistent with our values? Well, our value is love. And so asking folks, hey, when you encounter a person, a situation, an opportunity, what does love do? And be circumspect with that. You know, we had VBS last week. And so the question, do we do our midweek service or do we preempt our midweek service for VBS? Well, what's loving to the congregation? What's loving to the servants? What's loving to leadership? What's loving to visitors? And if we ask the question, hey, what is the loving thing to do from every perspective? We're probably going to be asking, what does God have for us here? And it's a way to catalyze that discussion. It's a way to catalyze prayer, and that's been so important for us. And then the second thing that we impart to folks is, hey, whatever you decide, however you feel led, whatever the Lord shows you, the next question you should ask is, who else needs to know? Who do I need to tell what the Lord is revealing to me, or what the Lord is allowing to happen around me? Part of that in our context is the safety net, to make sure that folks in leadership are cued in, but really for everybody. What is the Lord doing? So often in the New Testament and the Gospels, when Jesus would move, when Jesus would heal, when Jesus would speak, the next thing that happens is, hey, we're going to go tell people. And we try to do that, not only taking the message of the gospel out to the world, but within our fellowship. Hey, what's God doing? Let's tell each other about that, and let's rejoice in it.
Well said. Thank you for that word of encouragement, Patrick. You know, I want to thank you for joining us on this episode. I always learn something when I'm talking to you, and I love these pithy quotes that you have, and just the insight and the way the Lord is teaching you, and just the teachability. It's all just a wonderful thing. And thank you for joining us on this episode.
It's a blessing to be here. I would not be where I am if it were not for Appointment Ministries. and we'll always be grateful for your labors as well.
Okay, well, you are very welcome, and it's a blessing. So we're going to make these show notes available, of course, and in those show notes, we're going to include articles A, B, and C from what Pastor Patrick Farrell has written and what we talked about today. Also, we are going to be offering a follow-up Zoom call with Patrick that will allow for questions to be asked, and then Patrick having the time to give answers on this pretty important vision-altering, paradigm-shifting approach to ministry. So the call is going to be Pacific time. It's going to be on Tuesday, July 25th at 7 a.m. Pacific time. Tuesday, July 25th at 7 a.m. Pacific time. And so to join that call, just send us your email address and your name, of course, and we'll send you the link for the meeting. It's going to be a Zoom call, like I said. Send your name and email address to strongerpastors@gmail.com. strongerpastors@gmail.com. Looking forward to that Zoom call and sitting in and listening to your questions. So until then, and as the Lord continues to bless you in your ministry and strengthen your serve, may He continue to give you wisdom and strengthen you in your walk with Him and in your ministry with Him. And again, thanks for joining us.
Strength for Today's Pastor is sponsored by Pointman Ministries. You can find us at pointmanministries.com. That's spelled Poimen ministries.com. If something in today's program prompts a question or comment, or if you have a topic idea for a future episode, just shoot us an email at strongerpastors@gmail.com. That's strongerpastors@gmail.com. May the Lord bless you as you serve Him, His pastors, and His church.